Thank you, Neil, for your help. Okay, so we will begin now. Welcome to those of you who are here. I know most of you, which is lovely. My name is Asma Kazmi. I'm a professor in the art practice department and also at the Berkeley Center for New Media. I'm also a practicing artist. Thank you so much for coming to the talk today, which is hosted by the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, new visual art working group. This visual art working group is open to faculty, researchers, graduate students, and area scholars who are interested in collaborative and interdisciplinary exploration of the visual arts topics within a broad SWANA territory. Today's lecture is also co-sponsored by the Art Practice Department at UC Berkeley. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Aman Mujadidi. And Aman Mujadidi's artist talk is called Ethnography and Social Art, Vehicles for Cultural Understanding and Social Change. Aman Mujadidi comes from a lineage of Sufi mystics and modernizer kings from Afghanistan. He was born in the US and he's currently based in Paris. Aman has degrees in cultural anthropology, and his creative practice has utilized experimental ethnographic approach, combining qualitative research, traditional storytelling, and postmodern narrative strategies to create mixed media artworks. His works are often shown in site-specific contexts where he intentionally blurs the divisions between fact and fiction, documentation, and imagination. The themes that in his artworks include ideas of belonging, identity politics, conflict, artifactual history, and migration. Aman Mujadidi has shown extensively internationally, including at the Imperial War Museum in London, at Times Squares in New York City, Images Biennial in Rockslide, Denmark, the 3rd Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh, the 12th Havana Biennale in Cuba, the 3rd Asia Triennial Manchester, at the 1st Kochi Biennale in India, at Documenta 13 in Germany, and in 2012, Aman was selected as a TED Fellow for his subversively critical work within his art practice while he was living in Kabul in Afghanistan. I will now invite Aman Mujadidi to talk to us about his work. Please join me in warmly welcoming Aman Mujadidi.
Thank you, Asma. Hello to everyone. I don't know how many people are here, but thank you for joining us. I think we're a relatively small group, and so what I'm going to try to do is, rather than talking at you for too long, try and maybe make this more of a discussion Q&A, and kind of change the dynamic, because I don't actually like to talk at people that much anyway. And I think maybe we have a small enough group here to be able to maybe make it a bit more interesting and more engaging, and give you guys more time to, if you have comments or criticisms or questions or whatever you might have. So thanks to everyone, to Asma, to the Middle Eastern Center for Middle Eastern Studies for letting me have a talk. And so I'm not going to get too much into the definitions of things, because I kind of started when I was like, oh, I'm going to give a talk to these guys at Berkeley, and there's these departments involved, and so I started to kind of sit down, and I was like, oh, maybe I should do something really academic, right? I should have all of the academic foundations, to back up what I'm going to say, and make sure that it's linked into the trends and all that kind of stuff. And then at one point I kind of like stopped and I was like, well, wait a second, these are all students at university. So they've probably got a much better grasp of theory and trends than I do. So I stopped trying to do that. And I figured that I'll just give a few of my own thoughts on this approach, this kind of ethnographic approach to making art, and then go through some of my works, where because it's best for me to just speak from my experience, and kind of I've tried to kind of highlight. I don't have all of my favorite works, but I tried to highlight certain works that specifically have used ethnographic approaches to kind of realizing them. So, I mean, when we get into the role of art, as a vehicle for social change, or as a vehicle for kind of maybe bringing some sort of improvement or change within society, it's obviously it's difficult because, first of all, it's hard to gauge the results, so to speak. It's oftentimes also not oftentimes the kind of art that is the most valued within the kind of art world, let's say, but because that kind of art, where if you're really making art for kind of for social change, or to bring about change within society, then you're really making art much less for the collector and more for the collective, right? The collective of society. And so that's not always looked well upon. I mean, perhaps I'm generalizing, a little bit, but it can be problematic because, galleries in particular, they like objects that they can put on the wall and they can sell, or objects they can put on a pedestal and they can sell. How do you sell the idea of social change? It can become much more problematic for these kind of market-oriented entities, right, to really grasp the value of what the artist wants to do through the work that they're creating. So the relationship with the kind of art market can be complicated, I guess, is basically what I'm trying to say at times. With social art, a lot of people use the word social practice. I think that's the more common word within the sector, within the field. But I find social practice a bit complicated. I find that to be even a way in which the kind of art field has kind of maybe appropriated the idea of practice, because I could have a medical practice that's socially oriented, or I could have a meditation practice that's more socially oriented, or a karate practice, whatever, I mean, like a practice to be a social practice, it doesn't necessarily have to be the creation of art. So that's why I use the term social art. And again, I want to go back to that point of how do you actually gauge the impact of the work that you're doing. It's not always so easy, and but sometimes just the artist's desire to draw attention onto a certain subject is enough. Like a lot of times within certain contexts, I tell folks that I'm not necessarily always, through the work that I do, I'm not necessarily trying to present answers to problems or to issues or to things that are relevant. The subjects that I'm trying to point to in the work, oftentimes it's just to generate more questions about it and to get people to question more about that particular subject or that particular issue, right? So sometimes just that in and of itself can be very powerful, to get people to just kind of shift their view. What are these old things within these visual gestalts, right? Like, those drawings that are like if you look at it one way, it's a rabbit. Or if you look at the other, if you look at it, tweaked to one side, it's a duck, right? These kinds of things, because oftentimes that's all it takes. It just takes that one click, in someone's mind or in someone's perspective or in someone's understanding of a particular thing, to get them to see it differently, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're not trying to change the world. I'm not trying to change the world. Let's put it that way. You guys might be trying to change the world. I'm not trying to change the world because I don't actually think that I can change the world. But what I can possibly do is change the way in which people see the world. And then maybe there's things that kind of fall into place, over time, that can actually contribute to bringing about some sort of social change or some sort of societal change. And there's a big trend, I think, in anthropology within the last couple of years, in particular, within the last few years maybe, but the last couple of years, in using ethnographic approaches to making art. And I find it very interesting because I think there's a part of that desire is because it's more kind of in touch with people. It's more like I said before, for the collective. But ethnography in and of itself is problematic as a discipline, right? I mean, ethnography, anthropology, archaeology, all of these things, their historical origins, essentially out of the colonialist period of the 19th century, is very problematic. And so, I mean, ethnography and anthropology, and these guys were talking about, presenting noble savages to the world and that kind of thing. And so we have to be very careful too, that just going to the discipline of ethnology or ethnography as a vehicle for creative production doesn't by default make your work more egalitarian, more community-based, more sympathetic. I mean, there have been a lot of movements within ethnography over the last decades. You have the reflective anthropology, where you have to you reflect on yourself. There's what was some of the other ones? There was like cultural relativism was one of the first ones, right? Which is kind of like let people, they do their thing and you can't judge it, right? So cultural relativism, all this kind of reflexive anthropology, where within the field notes of anthropologists, they sometimes talked about themselves, their emotions, how they felt about what was going on. So these things tried to kind of break down the power dynamics within ethnographic field work, but they didn't completely succeed. And so the problems are still there. And then you have that kind of history coupled with the kind of bourgeois appropriated art world, which for all intents and purposes, regardless of all the work that's been done by a lot of amazing artists to kind of break down those hierarchies, it still exists, right? And so the art world itself is also very much controlled by a very kind of bourgeois perspective of art, of aesthetics, of all of these kinds of things. And so how do you actually like take something that's got these kind of this kind of colonialist rooted practice and this kind of bourgeois aesthetics practice and use and bring them together to do something that's actually grassroots, that's actually community building, that's actually helping to shed light on things towards a goal of bringing about change? I think the only way you can try to do that is by really feeling your inspiration, like really feeling who it is that you're inspired by, and getting to know them as much as possible, spending time with them, and if you're doing something, let's say, I don't know, so let's take a simple example like on homelessness, don't just take, but actually give back in a sense of like maybe go and volunteer, because not only will it actually help you in your research, but it will also be giving back in a very practical way, going and volunteering at a soup kitchen, right? Doing stuff. So I think for me, that's something that's fundamental, is that if we are inspired by an issue, by a people, by a subject, to also see not only what can we get to create the work that we want to create, but how can the process of our production also contribute to that on a practical level, so that it's not just the artwork that's potentially helping contribute to some sort of change, but the process through which we work actually contributes to that. And that's something I think for me has also been challenging but important to try and at least always keep it in mind, you know. And so I don't know, I've got some notes here, so I'm trying to keep myself on track and not go over. Sorry, I'm gonna light here. So I think so, and that point for me is really important, process, because for me in a lot of the work that I do, the process of creation, it's actually why I even started making art. Probably a lot of you started making art for the same reason, because you just liked making art, right? You like the process of creation. At some point, if you start to work with a gallery and the gallery wants to show your work, you know, they don't give a shit about your process, right? They want that product that goes on the wall that they can sell, you know? And so process is something that's much easier to, it's much easier oftentimes to work with curators if you're really into process-based work, or even institutions to some extent. Galleries, much less so. And if you're doing ethnographic art, it's very much process, you know, because there's a lot of research that goes in, a lot of qualitative research, a lot of first, like primary research, secondary research, you know. And so, and a lot of that may or may not appear in the actual thing that you create at the end, right? It doesn't always, right? And if it doesn't, then oftentimes, you know, it's like the iceberg, you know, people see the tip of what you actually created, but they don't see all the work you did underneath, you know, to actually create that tip, right? And so all that said, I'm gonna kind of jump into a few works. I'm gonna see if I can make this happen. So there's a share screen. Okay, I'm gonna do that. And then I'm going to open this. And I think we should be good. I'm gonna make it full screen mode. So, you know, ethnographic work essentially means also that you're engaged within a community, you're maybe even embedded within a community, so to speak. You spend time kind of understanding what's going on within the community, what are the issues and the subjects that are important to that particular community. So I'm going to start with an older work. This is from 2009, which is called Payback. This is while I was living in Afghanistan, and so, you know, the background to this was spending a lot of time in taxis with, you know, in people's cars, and you had a lot of checkpoints in Afghanistan. And so at each checkpoint, then you'd almost inevitably be asked for tea money. That was what it was called, the bribe. And it could be as little as 10 Afghanis, which is just a few cents. It's nothing. But you know, you get 10 Afghanis from I don't know, 500 cars in a day, and you know, it adds up to something. And so, you know, so I came up with this idea for Payback, which not only wanted to look at the issue of corruption and bribery, but also at the same time, the Taliban had started to, and other kind of radical groups had started to be able to access and purchase uniforms, like police uniforms, military uniforms, and wear them and actually set up fake checkpoints, get themselves into ministries where they launched coordinated attacks. So there was this kind of double play on not only the issue of corruption, but also how power could be so easily appropriated through the wearing of a uniform. And so I was able to go down to the market, get a police uniform. You'll see I'm not very well dressed because it's not even tucked in and all, but it worked. And we set up a fake checkpoint on the street in Kabul. We had to do it in between two real checkpoints, because checkpoints were always at intersections. So we had to do it on a straightaway, you know, in the middle of a long road, and basically stopped cars, checked their papers, checked their trunks, did the whole 9 yards. But in the end, rather than asking for a bribe, offered them a small amount of money back, and along with an apology if they ever had to actually pay bribes before. And so this was this whole project was called Payback, and was really trying to kind of like flip the script on not only how could I actually get people to stop, that the uniform, again, the power of the uniform, but then to completely change their perspective on what that would actually mean to get stopped. And so this was this project back from 2009, Payback. I'm going to kind of go through these. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. I may not even get through all of them. And then if there's any comments or questions or anything after, then we can do it that way. This project is called Untitled Table Number 1. And so this was another one where, at this time in Afghanistan, there was a lot of work being done on human rights, right? And different kinds of, civil rights within the country. And so I was interested in kind of getting an understanding of what people felt. These 50 framed questionnaires on the back are the 50 questionnaires that I put out there. They were to be, each questionnaire is handwritten by the interviewee. And it basically had two very simple questions. And one of them was, in your opinion, what are the 4 human rights that are most needed in Afghanistan? And the second one was, in your opinion, what are the 4 most violated human rights in Afghanistan? And so all of these, all of the questionnaires that we did are all there framed as kind of the spectators of the work. And I created this ping pong table with engraved rackets. So you'll see these were the 4 most mentioned rights that they felt Afghanistan should have. So freedom of religion, right to a better life, the rights of women, and rights of the poor. And you'll see that these rackets are a bit larger. So I had my own, like, what side should win. I had my own perspective in there. And then on the other side, the 4 most violated human rights were, so censorship, so like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, corruption, forced marriage, and child labor. And so this was a playable ping pong table, as you can see in this picture here. But, obviously with all of the engravings and all of the carvings, even into the table, I don't know if you see, there's a kind of map outline of Afghanistan, made, sometimes the ball would hit it and, shoot off to the side somewhere. And so it made playing very difficult, and which was part of the concept, to show how complicated it actually was in Afghanistan to even work on these issues. Because oftentimes within a country like Afghanistan, and not only Afghanistan, but the same people who are advocating for the rights are actually also the same culprits in violating them, right? And so the whole process of even working on these issues is incredibly complicated and convoluted. This work, I think, was from 2014, and it's called Commodified. And this was in the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, so the Manchester branch. And basically what I became interested in Manchester was the gift shop in the Imperial War Museum. And I became very interested in the way in which war becomes commodified. And talking to people, and again, a lot of this stuff is based on interviews, based on kind of getting people's input, spending time at the museum and speaking to guests, to visitors, to get an idea, because what are we commodifying, right? When we set up a gift shop, and there's clearly going to be a certain perspective within that gift shop, and we've already seen how commodified war becomes, anyway, just little simple kids' toys, camouflage clothing, all that kind of stuff, but I became interested to see, okay, well, what if I provide alternative products? And originally I wanted these products to be embedded within the shop itself and for sale, but the money I was going to donate to the museum. But the museum wouldn't allow it. It became too complicated for them because of some of the objects themselves. I don't know if you can read the T-shirt. It says, "My uncle went to Guantanamo Bay and all I got was this stupid T-shirt." There's the kind of conflict bling necklace, these little grenades, they're plastic grenades, but when you press the handle, it makes this, makes the sounds. These little play buckets with the little towels are like a child's waterboarding kit. You have Winning Hearts and Minds voodoo dolls in there. The Doritos and the Mars bars or the Snickers bars were basically Saddam Hussein's favorite snacks while he was imprisoned by the Americans. And you'll see they didn't even let me actually put my stand into the shop, which is across the hallway here, but they made me put it a bit aside so that people really knew that that it wasn't part of their merchandise. The mugs, the coffee mugs are keep calm and carry on with PTSD. The postcards are basically, they look like these very simple touristic postcards with these landscapes, but on the back, it tells you about when a drone strike took place in that general area. It's not the exact spot, but that province or that whatever, and how many people were killed as a result of the drone strike. So, so my whole thing was to kind of flip that script on which narrative and which story are you actually telling? Because within a war, there's always two sides, right? They say that the winner writes history, right? And so, so that was what this was, to kind of try and play with what that is. And yeah, they essentially put me off to the side here because it became a bit too controversial for them to actually put it within their shop. This was the Havana Biennale, where I essentially decided to do a work. What I was interested in for this was the US's attempt to close down Guantanamo Bay, and the handful of people, about more than a handful of prisoners that were there, who basically had their citizenship and their nationality stripped away from them. And so they didn't have a home to go back to. And other people weren't accepting them to come. And so the US was in this mad scramble to try and find a home for a lot of these detainees. I mean, and you have these former Guantanamo guys ending up in like Venezuela, all kinds of places. I think it was even in Venezuela where two or three of them actually went and camped out in front of the US embassy because they were like, send us back. We don't want to be here anymore. There's a whole history about this that you can look up and read about. And so what I wanted to do was kind of, this work is called Adrift. So it's like how their lives are basically adrift, as they try and find a home. So this ferry actually traveled. So this is one aspect of it. I don't have pictures of the other part, but I'll tell you about it quickly. And so you see these suitcases and stuff all piled up on top. So this ferry actually shuttles between Old Havana and Casablanca. Casablanca, of course, White House. So the ferry went back and forth with all this luggage on top. And so this was kind of a metaphor for the lives of these detainees kind of being shuffled or attempted to being shuffled back and forth from one nation to another, where they're going or not going, and how their lives are basically now adrift. But the other part of this project was also that I spoke with and interviewed a lot of locals within Havana to ask them also about their thoughts on Guantanamo Bay, what they knew about Guantanamo Bay, and if they could actually give a gift to one of these detainees when they left, what would it be? And so what I did was, from the interviews that I had, I created poems for a select of interviews, and for the thing that they said that they would give them, I went around trying to find those things. Some of them were very conceptual, but to take pictures of those things. And so then within the two stations, on the Old Havana side and the Casablanca side, the photos were printed and framed on the wall, and then the poems for each individual were also there next to it. So there was this also very much kind of personal, intimate almost expression from locals there about what their thoughts were about Guantanamo Bay, and to what extent they would actually want to kind of provide a certain level of hospitality, for the detainees when they left, so that they had a different idea of Cuba than the one that they had, the whole time that they were in prison in Guantanamo Bay. This work was the one I did for the Dhaka Art Summit, and this one was kind of my attempt to. It's called Untitled Garden #1, and this was kind of my attempt to address the issue that I had spoken a lot about with artists from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, about the way in which the Eurocentric art gaze was upon them, how these kind of, and what I had seen personally in Afghanistan, what I felt, and the way in which these kind of Western, Euro, America-centric curators were starting to descend upon countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, again, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all of these kind of, not just global South, but also conflict countries. And it was almost this way in which they were kind of the new anthropologists, discovering the new noble savages, which were the artists from these countries, and then bringing them back to present them to, the Western world. Might as well put them in a cage and show them, right? And so this was something that I was very interested in looking at. And so in the research that I did, I came across this kind of 19th century pseudoscientist, James Churchward, who actually had this idea of the lost civilization of Mu. And the lost civilization of Mu was essentially a white civilization, very advanced white civilization, that in this theory, it was the foundational civilization for all other great civilizations that came after, the Egyptians, Cambodia, I mean, everywhere, India, like all of these other great civilizations, South America, Central America, they all came from this white, which obviously makes very sense. He was a British colonialist, 1800s, of course, everybody comes from white people. White people were the top, were the pinnacle, and, everyone else came after. And so I discovered this idea of this civilization, Mu, but I had also, through my own kind of meditation work and other interests in kind of Zen practices at the time, found that the word, Mu is also a word in Zen Buddhism, which means nothingness. And so my attempt was to kind of merge together these ideas through a Zen garden of the way in which this theory appropriates all of these other civilizations within it. It's as if it's making them into nothing. It's as if it's negating their entire value, And so the symbols in the top there, it's katakana here on the top, Japanese, that says Mu. And the symbol of the crown is actually this, according to Churchward, in a book that he did, there were all these symbols for the civilization of Mu. And that symbol was the symbol, according to him, for the lands of the West. And so anyway, it was this very kind of Zen space. You could come, have a seat, look outside, but ultimately very much charged with this very kind of Eurocentric colonialist energy within the space. This is the project I did at the Images Biennale in Denmark, and this was called What They Fear. And this was also at the time, I think it was 2015, maybe 2016. There was also a big surge to the right politically in Denmark. There were a lot of incredibly racist policies being put into place against migrants coming into the country. And so I was interested in kind of exploring what people in Roskilde thought about this. And so I had a questionnaire with one simple question. And that simple question was, what is it that you or someone you know fears about the arrival of migrants into Denmark? And so then I can't remember how many questionnaires I actually implemented, but I took the top 3 answers. And the top 3 answers were loss of identity, loss of Danish identity, so identity loss, a lower standard of living because they thought too much money would be given to migrants and not enough, to the Danes themselves, and radical Islam. So you see, so this was a collaboration with the Roskilde Medical University. So those women in white that you see behind the counters there, they're all medical students. They all will be doctors one day. And we set up an immunization clinic. And so the idea that I had was, okay, so people can come in. This is 2016, right? So this is before all the COVID stuff and all that. But people could come in and basically choose which one of these fears. Was it Is it the loss of identity? Is it the loss of a standard of living? Or is it the fear of a radical Islam? Did they want to be immunized against? Okay. And originally I wanted to actually inject people with a placebo, but then we found out that that was against the law in Denmark. No one could actually administer an injection if there wasn't a doctor. So the Biennale wouldn't allow me to do it. Then I wanted to find some sort of dilation drops to put in people's eyes, which also had this metaphor of changing their perspective. But I couldn't find any sort of dilation drops that only lasted for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And so there was obviously a safety hazard of people, leaving the tent and driving off or walking off because their eyes are going to be dilated for the next 6 hours. So we ended up using just kind of drops, syringes, not without needles, and dropping into under the tongue of people. But the students were fantastic. The medical students, they really played the role. They were telling them that you shouldn't drink alcohol in the next 24 hours. They really got into it. And so that was specifically looking at that. And again, all of these to some extent are geared towards trying to change people's perspective, right? Change the way they see a particular subject, and it was great because we had a kind of waiting area where in the end, oftentimes people who finished their immunization got into conversations with people who were still, waiting to get theirs. And so it was really fascinating to see, how people ended up kind of engaging in debate and dialogue about it within the tent. Once Upon a Future, this is a project I did in Times Square a few years ago. And so this was basically just at the beginning of Trump. I mean, it actually launched. I was working on it in 2016. And I think just before I left New York, the project was slated for 2017. But I was there doing research in 2016, and just before I left, Trump got elected, like 3 days before I left. I've never heard New York so quiet the day after. People were comparing it to 9/11, actually. Like I don't know, but people were saying that level of silence, people just were in a fog. And so but because of Trump had already been around, obviously he was already doing his thing, and so what I wanted to do was do a project that looked at the kind of migration stories and immigration stories of New Yorkers from the 5 boroughs. And so what I did was spend several months going around and collecting those stories, audio collection of those stories. Simultaneously, I was interested in the fact that the New York City phone booths were being removed from the streets, right? And so I was like, oh, well, maybe there's a way to kind of bring these two things together. Originally, the plan, my idea wasn't to necessarily have it in Times Square. I wanted phone booths to be installed around the city in different places. But due to a chain of events, it did end up in Times Square. And so basically what we did was I found the phone booths. We had to completely renovate them and remodel them and make them, functional in a sense. Most of them didn't have doors anymore, so we had to put doors in them. Okay, great, thanks, Asma. And so, oops, close this now. And so basically, you could step inside, pick up the phone, and listen to the migration stories that I had collected from the 5 boroughs of New York. And those stories were in whatever language the person wanted to say them in. One, because I wanted anyone who was listening to hear the emotion in their voice when they told their story, because anyone who would be translating wouldn't be able to do the same. And secondly, I wanted to see how people reacted when they were confronted with a language they didn't understand, which is often the case for people who are migrating into a country like the US or here in Europe. They're also confronted oftentimes with languages that they don't understand, and they have to get through it, And so this was up for oops, I'm having an issue here now. Oh, okay. Oh yeah, there you go. So that was that. I think this is the last one, so I'll try and speed through it a bit. I think I have a few minutes left. And so this so that was Once Upon a Future. It was up for 3 months in the summer of 2017 in Times Square. This was a project called Once Upon a Place. Oh, that was Remembering a Future. This is Once Upon a Place, sorry. And so here, basically, it was this kind of lecture performance at the Imperial War Museum in London. And it was a lot about the idea of home. And so what I tried to do here, this kind of was, I really spoke people through, and I did a project that was participatory so people could engage. So this timeline here started out fairly empty. And it's a political timeline. The show was called Art Since 9/11. And so the beginning of the timeline on the left side there is 9/11, all the way through to the date of the project itself. And so within that timeline, then I put certain things that happened in my life, as well as certain kind of political events. Because for me, you know, there's the whole expression that got popularized by Carolyn Hainish, that the personal is political. Within the feminist movement, right? And so for me, what's also is that the political is also personal. So the personal is political, the political is personal, the reverse. And so what I was interested in is that within this timeline of political events, there were also very personal things happening in people's lives, including mine, my child being born, different things, you know? And so then people could come in throughout the performance, which was done over the course of a week, several times a day over the course of a week, and they could add in their own personal events into the timeline. And so this thing filled out over the course of 1 week, from there being maybe 4 or 5 or 6 things written on there to it completely being packed with people's personal stories. You had other parts, there were kind of different stations within this installation. So I walked people through. There were different things that they had to engage with within the performance, within the lecture performance. This is a view from Calais looking out towards the UK, which is the destination for a lot of people who are in Calais, that people had to sit and kind of feel like what it must feel like to be one of these migrants who's left everything behind and is trying to get across this body of water, has made it all the way here and is now trying to get there. And at the very end of the kind of tour through the space, there was this kind of, what does it mean to rebuild? And so at a certain point also, I had asked people at the very beginning to write down on a little card what home means for them, a word, a sentence, whatever it is, and to keep it with them. At another point in the performance, I asked people to take that card and rip it up into tiny pieces, as if now that they've lost everything that they feel like, what they think home means to them, they've lost it. And then when we get to here at the very end, and I'm mixing the mortar, I asked people to basically put their pieces of paper, their torn pieces of paper of home, into the mortar, mix it up, and then that is used as the mortar to kind of rebuild. So it's all this metaphor for then you have to take those broken pieces and build something new again, right? Build something up again. And so it was very participatory. It was very engaging. It really brought people into not only thinking about what's happening politically with the migration issue, but also their own personal reaction to that. There was also other migration of Europeans going to, say, Iraq and Syria to fight with Daesh. What did that mean? You know, so there were all these different kind of points in which getting people to shift their idea, right? Shift their perspective and think a bit differently about these different issues. I think that is, hang on, what is this going to do here? I think that's my last slide. So I think I came in even under my time a little bit. I might have sped through things, and I apologize, but it's good now we have some time. If there's anything that you guys want to ask about, then we can, and we'll be able to speak about things a bit more. So I'm going to leave it there, Asma. I'm going to stop share, and yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Aman. The timing was perfect. Sorry, my camera just takes a minute to turn on for some reason there. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and for talking us through your work and situating it within, these larger history of ideas around ethnography and how your work pushes the limit of that field as well as of what we do within our art. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you for being here. I would love to ask if you'd like to ask Aman questions, please put it in the chat or in the, is there a Q&A box here as well? Okay, so yeah, I think maybe the chat would be great just because it's a small group. So it can be more intimate, and that way I have to navigate fewer windows. So, while everyone formulates their thoughts and questions, I'd love to ask you a couple of things. You spoke really thoughtfully about how it's really hard to gauge results, when we do works such as the kind of work that you're doing. And this is a question that actually I think about within my own practice for the kinds of works that I make. Do you think that you're impacted by the work that you make, as the artist? And if so, how does one gauge that? Is there a way to sort of quantify that or think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely impacted by the work. I mean, I think oftentimes how I kind of approach my artistic practice, I mean, my whole kind of practice this has all kind of led me to a place to where kind of so much of just what I kind of do in life now is my practice, or the way in which I maybe certain healing practices or different kind of things we do. It's like say, let's just look at meditation. If you meditate, once you're done meditating, we might want to try and understand, okay, well, what kind of impact has that meditation had on me, right? And so, but that's actually irrelevant, in the end. And ultimately, the thing to have kind of confidence in is that while you meditated, the work was being done. The impact was being done, right, on you, and then by default, how you are with others is already there. The work is already done. And so so I feel like for me, even with these kinds of practices, I feel like that's the case. You do the work, and it's almost as if the impact is already done. And for me personally, I think, other people might think differently, but for me personally, it's then not necessary for me to go off and find some sort of quantitative justification or quantitative proof that the work that I did had an impact. I'm very much into the idea of like the just by doing it, you've made an impact. The impact has happened. The fact of people coming and seeing it, going home and maybe talking about it at dinner, there's all kinds of ways in which impact happens, and it doesn't have to be these grandiose world-changing moments. It can literally just be a conversation between a couple who saw your work, a conversation that maybe they wouldn't have had if they hadn't seen your work. So I feel like by the fact of doing, it's done. Basically.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was also struck by how your social art is really unsettling for the receiver, right? To ask someone to place themselves in the immunization work. I think it's called What They Fear. To ask people to identify their fears and then sit back and receive a drop in their mouth. It's really uncomfortable making. Yeah, I mean, I'm so curious about the people who walked away from that chair. What the rest of their day look like.
Yeah, no, me too. I mean, I would love to be, like, if possible, I would love to be able to have a whole, like, because there's the pre-process, there's the process of production. I would love to be able to have a whole other extended process with people after. That becomes much more difficult, to then kind of spend time with people who might have engaged with the work and actually follow up with them after. But even with that work, what was really fascinating to me was the whole point was that people to come in, look at those three fears and decide which one they felt they wanted to be immunized against, which tells you then that also was something it was very much an intimate look into this person's worldview within this context, where they're basically, if they're going to the Islam one stand, or they're going to the loss of identity stand, they're showing you, a complete stranger and other strangers around, what is potentially their thing, right? Like what are they having a bit of a hard time with, and what do they want to let go of? And I honestly feel, I mean, I really believe that there's a certain catharsis in just that process. It's like these kinds of ritualized practices we can do. If there's something that we want to release, some sort of emotion or some sort of thing that we want to let go of, there's all these ritualized practices of writing things down on paper and then burning the paper, or writing it down and burying it into the earth. These things are very cathartic just through the act of doing them. It creates a catharsis. And I feel like that's the case within a project like that. That's kind of what happens.
Well, I'm happy that you're optimistic about this.
You caught me on a good day. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you're working on now. Perhaps a project that you didn't talk about that's percolating.
Well, I have, but what I'm doing now, actually, so in the last many years, I've been really getting into kind of different kinds of kind of healing modalities, shamanic practices, and things like that. And so now that has kind of become my practice in a way. And so I'm doing shamanic trance dance twice a month here in Paris, which basically I consider that to be almost like two performances, quote unquote, a month. And it's also a kind of like self-healing practice through breath work and dance. And I guide people on shamanic voyaging with a tambour they want to find out who is their power animal. Sometimes they want to connect with an ancestor, and so that has very much become my work lately. And I'm in the process of developing ideas I've been invited to participate in an exhibition at the Linden Museum in Stuttgart, where it's kind of doing they're reflecting upon their Afghanistan collection. They have a collection of marbles, of photographs, of different artifacts. And like a lot of museums now, they're in the process of reflecting on their collection. How did they get it? What's the kind of background? What's the origin? What kind of stuff was on the black market? What was, like they're trying to have so they've had one series of kind of talks, debates, and things like that on it. And the next thing is to invite artists to do some sort of intervention. So that's very much, I mean, it's an ethnology museum. So that becomes very much how does ethnography and art intersect? So that's something I'm kind of developing at the moment. And otherwise, yeah, I've been painting a lot. There's these kind of very I don't paint at all, right? I took one painting class in my life and I was horrible at it, but I've been having fun. I've been just letting it go, and I've been, and I'm working on developing also in the same way that I'm doing these shamanic trance dances, where you do this kind of breathing technique before, and then you dance, and I create playlists for the dance. But I'm also looking into developing the same idea, but doing the breathing technique that essentially is what kind of helps you go into trance or kind of modified consciousness. So I'm trying to see about how to do that, and then painting. And so that's kind of what I've been experimenting. What I'm experimenting with is putting myself into trance states through breath work, and then kind of letting go. And so yeah, so that's kind of the stuff I'm playing around with.
Yeah, well, that sounds it sounds fascinating, and you're really sort of drawing into your Sufi lineage, or drawing
Yeah,
from your
yeah,
Sufi lineage, which is
very much so.
lovely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, well, so we have Fred, Juniper, and Samuel here, who are all wonderful, amazing artists. And I wonder if they have any questions or comments. I can actually maybe, let's see. Um, hmm. I'm wondering if I can
Bring them in.
promote them to panelists. And I know that some of you may not want to turn on your video, but it would be great to have your voice. So Samuel has a question. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to how you think of material in your practice.
Oh yeah, thanks, Samuel. Actually, for me, what material I actually use in the different projects is very much driven by the project and not really by me, to be honest. You'll see that, like, in the different works that I showed, even they can be very different in what I use and what I don't. And so oftentimes it's more the kind of research that I do. Eventually then it kind of just comes to me of how that should be presented, what kind of materials I should use, what kind of materials I can use. And so it really depends. It really depends on the project itself, that what ultimately then ends up seeming to me like the best material to use and the best way to use it in order to get the points across. And so it can be really wide ranging. And ultimately, if I can, but again, what's kind of particular about me is that, I didn't study art at all, guys. Really, I literally took one art class in university in my life. So I don't have a lot of what I do, I've kind of developed over time, but I don't have the kind of technical training in working with materials either. So for me, that's often a big learning curve, like the Untitled garden. Okay, so I mean, that's just kind of building a walkway and stuff like that. It's fairly straightforward. But then in some practices, in some projects, I find myself limited, and so I collaborate, with people, technically limited, I should say, and so I collaborate with people, then to come in. I'm not really very good with metal work, and so when I worked on those phone booths, I hired a guy, to work with me on revamping the phone booths and doing all that kind of work. I'm not an audio tech guy necessarily, so I got some guys who helped me rig the phone boxes into audio players, so that when you picked up the phone, it would play back. So it's yeah, so I feel like the project itself, or the work itself, ends up kind of dictating the materials. Now, if a day comes when the project dictates that it needs to be these huge paintings, then I might be a bit screwed, because I don't know how I would realize because like I said, I can't really paint, and I don't know if I would hire someone to paint, something for me per se, maybe. But so it could be limited, but up to now, I haven't been faced with that so far. So it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, hiring someone to paint for you sounds
It
sounds
sounds a bit weird, even though I've hired people to help do other stuff like that. Just to me sounds a bit weird. Yeah.
yeah, but maybe it's worth trying and seeing what happens.
Well, you know why though, I think it really bothers me is so I used to just quickly, when I lived in LA for a while, I worked as an art handler. And so I, in galleries and museums, and we would go and we would install. And so one of the clients that I worked for a company. And so one of the clients of our company was the Gagosian Gallery in LA. And so we went, and they had their own guy, but oftentimes we would be brought in to help support different installations and stuff if he needed assistance. And they were having a big Rauschenberg exhibition. And I'll never forget arriving into the gallery, and there was this huge painting, vertical painting hanging on the wall, and there was a guy, Rauschenberg, sitting in a chair facing the painting. So his back was to us when we walked in. I walked in closer and I saw there were 3 of his assistants on their knees. This was a huge painting, so it went almost down to the ground, on their knees, painting the painting, right? I mean, they're literally painting it. Like he's sitting there, and there's these three assistants on their knees, on their hands and knees, painting the painting, and he's sitting in this chair, observing them, but with a book. He's looking at a book, and the book is a book about Robert Rauschenberg. And that scene, I think, just like completely, changed my first of all, my respect for him. The second, the idea of having someone else paint for you, I think, is maybe very much influenced by that particular experience.
Yeah, or Damien Hirst,
or David, or any, or a handful. You could probably name tons of them. Exactly. Yeah.
So let's see. Fred has a question about, let's see. How do you work? Fred, could you speak your question?
Men healing circles.
Could you say your question?
Oh yeah, I was thinking, you did the male healing circles, right? Or the men's circle in your spiritual practice. But then also you were looking at these takes on war and what that's all about in Afghanistan. And I was wondering, how do you work the spiritual into the work? You're talking about it, and
well,
thought about that, and vice versa, because they go hand in hand, right? The war and then masculinity and then healing and all that together. How do you work that into your art?
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate that question. And that kind of comes back a little bit to what I was saying before, where actually it's not, for me now at this point, it's not even really about working the healing circles or working the work that I'm doing through these circles or through the shamanic trance dance or through other methods like holotropic breathing or different modalities. It's not even about how do I work that into the art. That's now kind of become my art, to be honest. That actually has become my practice. And so there's this convergence that's happened just almost naturally. And yet the ways in which then things like war become expressed through them can be very different. So like when I was in this summer, September, so about a month after the Taliban ended up basically taking Kabul and took over Afghanistan, I was still working there. I mean, going back and forth. I had art projects there with local artists, and I had to close everything, and I was in the US at the time when all of that happened, and then I spent the next, a bit of time closing things down. But then when I was in the mountains of Spain and doing this kind of trance dancing was the first time that I was able to kind of sit down. Through that dance, I actually was able to kind of mourn the loss of what I was doing, because I started to realize that from the time I started working with and for Afghanistan to this past summer, it was basically 23 years with a little gap, a couple gaps here and there. But essentially, that's a 23-year career that, for the time being, at least, has kind of come to an end. And so this whole kind of my own reaction to my personal relationship with the taking of the country by Taliban, not only my professional relationship, but my personal one, and the shamanic work that I was doing, the shamanic work allowed me to actually express those feelings and that kind of sense of mourning and the subject of the ongoing subject of war through the work, and so through the dance. And so, yeah, so I mean, it's still something that I'm kind of trying to understand, because it's something very hard to, it's something you feel, right? And like so many artists, they feel something, and then trying to actually, like, you know, mentalize it and express it becomes something else. And this is kind of what's happening here, though. But that work that I'm doing, that kind of healing work, the different kind of modalities that I'm using, have essentially become my practice. Yeah, I mean, it's the simplest way to put it, I guess.
Well, that kind of goes back to what you were saying before. You talked about the collector and the collective, right?
Yeah.
And how your work is for the collective and not necessarily for the collector.
Yeah. And even now with this shamanic trance dance, I'm offering 2 sessions a month. People come, you know, it's about sharing it with people, you know, and they tell other people, and they, you know, and so it's really it's really gone in that direction more and more. So yeah, we'll see what comes of it over the long term.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those spaces, without seeing an image of it, but just from your description, just feel like really potent, productive spaces where, you know, perhaps meaning gets made through a physical act rather than conversation or the exchange of, you know, a commodity. So yeah, sounds really incredible. I hope I can experience one when I see you this summer.
Great, yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So I wanted to point out, Aman, that Juniper is here and Samuel, and you'll meet them both. Juniper just left tomorrow. So, you know, so
Okay, we are doing the studio visits tomorrow.
Yes, Fred,
Okay,
is that
great.
right?
Yes, that's right. Hala, Edgar, and Juniper.
Okay, great.
Okay. Hala, it's Hala and Edgar and Juniper. Okay, perfect.
And so
yeah.
what time should we do those?
And they start at 9 o'clock our time, and then the way Zoom is set up, you can't do quarter of an hour, so they're like set up on the hour. So 9, 10, 11. Is that gonna be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, 9, 10, 11. So that means 6, 7, 8 for me. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and feel free to, you know, break in the middle and refresh and renew your energy, because those conversations can be really intense, and three meetings, yeah, it could be a lot. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aman, and I'm grateful to all the artists who were also here to hear you talk about your work, and I look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so so tomorrow, I guess you guys will send me another Zoom link, or is that how it's going to work?
Yeah, I'll send you a Zoom link as soon as we finish here.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate this. This was fun.
Yeah, it was really fun. Great. Okay.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thank you, Neil.
Yep. Have a good rest of the day.
Yes.